Who hurt you the deepest when you were most vulnerable? I woke up at 2:15 a.m. to the sound of my wife's voice in the hallway, soft and intimate in a way she hadn't spoken to me in months. He doesn't suspect anything. The new medication keeps him foggy enough. My bedroom door was cracked open maybe 3 inches, enough to hear her clearly, but not enough to see who she was talking to. I'd been bedridden for 6 weeks after a motorcycle accident shattered my left leg and cracked 3 ribs, dependent on Diane for everything from meals to medications to basic dignity. The woman I'd been married to for 9 years was discussing me like I was a problem to be managed, and the tenderness in her voice wasn't meant for me. It was meant for whoever was on the other end of that phone call. My hands gripped the sheets as I heard her laugh, quiet and conspiratorial, before she said the words that made my blood turn cold. By the time the competency hearing happens, he'll be so medicated they'll have no choice but to grant it. Then everything transfers to me. I'd been a civil engineer for 12 years, working for a firm that designed infrastructure projects across 3 states. Diane and I had met at a charity gala where she'd been volunteering and I'd been representing my company. She was radiant that night, working the silent auction table with easy charm and a smile that felt like coming home. We'd married after a 2-year courtship that felt effortless, built a life in a renovated Victorian house on the east side, and settled into what I thought was a solid partnership. She worked as a pharmaceutical sales rep, traveled frequently for conferences, made good money. We'd talked about kids, but never quite pulled the trigger, always one more year away from the right time. Looking back now, I wonder if she'd been planning her exit even then, waiting for the perfect opportunity. The accident happened on a Saturday morning in late August. I'd been riding my Ducati through the canyon roads outside the city, a routine I'd maintained for 5 years without incident. A pickup truck ran a stop sign at a rural intersection, clipped my rear wheel at 45 miles per hour, and sent me tumbling across asphalt like a rag doll. I remembered the impact, the sudden weightlessness, then nothing, until I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later. Shattered femur requiring surgical reconstruction with pins and plates, 3 broken ribs, severe road rash across my back and shoulders, mild concussion. The orthopedic surgeon, Dr. Eleanor Briggs, had been blunt about recovery time, 6 months minimum before I'd walk normally, possibly longer given the complexity of the leg fracture. I'd need intense physical therapy, pain management, and complete bed rest for the first 2 months. Diane had been there when I woke up, tears streaming down her face, holding my hand like it was the only thing anchoring her to earth. "I thought I'd lost you," she'd whispered, and I'd believed every word. She'd taken family leave from her job to care for me, converted our guest room downstairs into a recovery space so I wouldn't have to navigate stairs, hired a physical therapist for home visits. She'd seemed like the perfect wife, the woman who'd step up when her husband needed her most. The first 2 weeks were brutal, pain so intense that morphine barely touched it, humiliation at needing help to shower, to use the bathroom, to do anything beyond lie in bed and heal. Diane had handled it all with patience and grace, or so I'd thought. The first strange detail I noticed came 3 weeks into recovery. My pain medication schedule was strict. Oxycodone every 6 hours, with ibuprofen for breakthrough pain. But I started noticing gaps in my memory, hours that seemed to vanish. I'd be watching the news at 2 p.m., and suddenly it would be 7 p.m., with no recollection of the intervening time. I mentioned it to Diane, who'd brushed it off as normal for someone on heavy pain medication. "Your body needs rest to heal. The doctor said some memory loss is expected." It made sense, so I accepted it. But the gaps kept growing, and with them came a vague unease I couldn't quite articulate. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. The physical therapist started coming 3 times a week. His name was Graham Ashford, a 30-something guy with an easy smile and expensive watch who seemed overly familiar with my wife. They'd laugh together in the kitchen while preparing my lunch, inside jokes I wasn't part of, touches that lingered just a fraction too long when they passed each other in doorways. I told myself I was being paranoid, that pain and immobility were making me see threats where none existed. Graham was professional during our sessions, pushing me through range-of-motion exercises with the right balance of encouragement and challenge. He knew his stuff, had credentials from a top program, came highly recommended by Dr. Briggs. I should have been grateful Diane had found someone so qualified. But something felt wrong about the way they interacted when they thought I was sleeping. I'd pretend to doze during afternoon therapy sessions, watching through barely opened eyes as Graham's hand would rest on Diane's lower back while they discussed my progress. As he'd lean in close to whisper something that made her smile. Small touches, casual intimacy, the kind of unconscious physical language that spoke to familiarity beyond professional courtesy. I started staying more alert, fighting through the medication fog to observe them. The more I watched, the more certain I became that something was happening between my wife and the man she'd hired to help me recover. Week 4 brought financial irregularities I couldn't ignore. Our bank sent notifications to my email about large transfers from our joint savings account, 3 separate withdrawals of $15,000 each, spaced 10 days apart. I called Diane in to look at my laptop, asked about the transfers. She'd had an explanation ready. "Medical expenses, honey. The insurance is being difficult about covering some of your treatment costs. I'm making sure you get the best care. It sounded reasonable, but something nagged at me. I'd reviewed our insurance policy before the accident, knew our out-of-pocket maximum was $8,000. We shouldn't need $45,000 in additional medical funds. I asked to see the bills, and Diane had promised to bring them later. She never did. I started tracking my medication more carefully, noting the times Diane gave me pills versus what the prescription labels indicated. The schedule didn't match. She was giving me double doses of certain medications, particularly the oxycodone and a new prescription I didn't recognize. Small white tablets she claimed were muscle relaxants. The extra medication explained the memory gaps, the persistent fog that made thinking feel like wading through mud. I started palming the pills, pretending to swallow while actually tucking them in my cheek, then spitting them out after Diane left the room. Within 2 days, my head began to clear. The fog lifted enough to notice details I'd been missing. Diane was gone for hours at a time, claiming she was running errands or attending to work issues. But her hair would smell like cologne when she returned, and she'd shower immediately, every single time. Graham's therapy visits stretched longer than necessary, and I'd hear them talking in the kitchen long after our sessions ended, voices low and intimate. They thought I was too drugged to notice, too dependent to question. They were building something together while I lay helpless in a hospital bed they'd installed in what used to be my home office. The realization came slowly, then all at once. My wife was having an affair with my physical therapist, and they were using my injuries to facilitate it. The night I overheard Diane's phone call about the competency hearing, I made a decision. I'd been collecting the pills she'd been overprescribing, hiding them in an envelope taped behind my nightstand. I had maybe 40 tablets documenting her efforts to keep me sedated beyond medical necessity. The next morning, I pretended to be groggier than I was, let Diane believe her medication strategy was working. While she was out running errands, I used my laptop to search for lawyers specializing in medical power of attorney and financial fraud. I found Andrew Whitmore, a family law attorney with a background in elder abuse cases, which seemed close enough to my situation. I called his office, explained my circumstances to his paralegal, and requested an emergency consultation. Andrew came to my house that afternoon, a tall man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested he'd heard every terrible story humans could tell each other. I showed him everything: the pills I'd been stockpiling, the bank transfer notifications, the medication schedule that didn't match my prescriptions, my observations about Diane and Graham's relationship. Andrew listened without judgment, taking notes on a legal pad, asking pointed questions about my mental state, my awareness, my ability to make decisions. "Mr. Holloway," he said finally, "I think someone is trying to establish grounds to have you declared incompetent. If they succeed at a competency hearing, they could gain legal control over your finances, your medical decisions, everything." The word incompetent hit me like a physical blow. I'd built a career on precision and competence, had designed bridges and water systems that served thousands of people. Now my own wife was trying to have me declared mentally unfit so she could take control of assets we'd built together. Andrew explained the process. She'd need medical documentation supporting her claim, testimony from care providers about my inability to manage my own affairs, evidence of erratic behavior or decision-making. The overmedication would provide exactly that documentation, if Dr. Briggs or another physician noted my confusion, memory issues, or impaired judgment in medical records, Diane could use those notes in court. The plan was elegant and vicious. Andrew recommended bringing in a private investigator to document Diane's activities and a psychiatrist to evaluate my current mental state. I agreed to both, despite knowing my savings were being drained by the woman I was paying to investigate. The PI, a former detective named Raymond Cross with 23 years of experience, started surveillance immediately. The psychiatrist, Dr. Julian Foster, came to the house under the guise of being a specialist in pain management psychology. Diane bought the story, even seemed pleased I was seeking additional support. Dr. Foster spent 2 hours evaluating me, administering cognitive tests, asking about my mood and mental state. His conclusion, documented in a formal report, was unequivocal. I showed no signs of cognitive impairment, depression, or inability to make reasoned decisions. Any confusion I'd experienced was consistent with overmedication, not underlying mental incompetence. Raymond's surveillance revealed what I'd suspected, but hoped wasn't true. Diane and Graham were meeting at a luxury hotel 3 miles from our house, regular afternoon visits timed between my therapy sessions. Raymond photographed them entering together, leaving separately, captured timestamps that proved a pattern. He also followed Diane to a law office downtown, where she met with an attorney specializing in conservatorships and guardianships. Raymond obtained public records showing she'd filed preliminary paperwork for a competency hearing, scheduled for 6 weeks out. She was building her case systematically, and I'd been completely unaware until that overheard phone call. The medication scheme was more sophisticated than I'd initially realized. Andrew subpoenaed my medical records and prescription history. What we found was damning. Graham had been submitting notes to Dr. Briggs after each therapy session, documenting my confusion, inappropriate responses to pain, and possible cognitive decline post-accident. These notes, which I'd never seen, were being used to justify increased medication, and raise concerns about my decision-making capacity. Dr. Briggs, trusting Graham's professional assessment, had prescribed additional medications and noted in my file that I was struggling with recovery beyond normal parameters. Diane had essentially weaponized my own medical care against me. I confronted the issue during my next appointment with Dr. Briggs, which I insisted on attending remotely via video call rather than having Diane drive me. I brought Andrew and Dr. Foster into the call, presented the evidence of overmedication, showed her the pills I'd been stockpiling that didn't match prescribed amounts. Dr. Briggs went pale as she reviewed the documentation. "Mr. Holloway, this is extremely concerning. If someone has been administering medication beyond prescribed levels, that's a serious issue. And these notes from your physical therapist? I relied on his professional judgment, but if they're inaccurate, we need to address this immediately." She ordered immediate changes to my medication plan, insisted on weekly check-ins directly with me, and stated she'd be reviewing Graham's credentials and reporting procedures. Diane's response to my sudden clarity was to escalate. 2 days after my call with Dr. Briggs, she tried to have me involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation. She called 911, claimed I was having a mental health crisis, was threatening self-harm and speaking incoherently. The paramedics who arrived found me calmly sitting in bed, reading medical journals on my laptop, clearly oriented and rational. I showed them Dr. Foster's recent evaluation, explained that my wife was attempting to have me declared incompetent for financial reasons. The senior paramedic, a woman named Joyce, who'd apparently seen this scenario before, documented everything and declined to transport me. "Sir, you're clearly competent and not in crisis. We can't force you into psychiatric hold based on someone else's statement when you're obviously fine." That failure prompted Diane to change tactics. She filed for emergency guardianship, claiming I was unable to care for myself due to my injuries and medication dependence. The hearing was scheduled for 5 days out, expedited because of my urgent medical needs. Andrew filed an emergency response, included Dr. Foster's evaluation, Dr. Briggs's updated medical assessment, and Raymond's surveillance photos showing Diane's affair. The judge, Margaret Sullivan, reviewed everything and ordered an independent medical evaluation before proceeding. She appointed a court evaluator, Dr. Vincent Harper, to assess my competency within 72 hours. The stakes couldn't have been clearer. If Dr. Harper found me incompetent, Diane would gain control of everything. If he found me competent, her entire scheme would collapse. Dr. Harper arrived on a Friday morning, a meticulous man in his 60s who'd conducted thousands of competency evaluations for the courts. He spent 4 hours with me, administering cognitive tests, reviewing my medical history, asking detailed questions about my finances, my marriage, my understanding of the situation. I was honest about everything, showed him the evidence I'd gathered, explained my decision to secretly stop taking the extra medication Diane had been giving me. Dr. Harper took copious notes, asked to interview Diane separately, then requested to speak with Graham as well. His thoroughness gave me hope, but also anxiety. Everything depended on his assessment. The evaluation revealed more than I'd expected. When Dr. Harper interviewed Diane, she apparently broke down and admitted significant details. She'd been having an affair with Graham for 8 months, since before my accident. They'd seen my injuries as an opportunity to accelerate their plans. Graham had deliberately documented false information in his therapy notes to build a case for my incompetence. Diane had been over-medicating me to create the appearance of cognitive decline. The plan had been to gain guardianship, liquidate our assets, and eventually divorce me while I was still legally incompetent to contest the settlement. Dr. Harper documented all of it, including Diane's admission that she'd gone too far, but felt trapped in the scheme. His report was devastating for Diane and exonerating for me. Dr. Harper found me fully competent with no cognitive impairment. He noted that any confusion I'd experienced was directly attributable to over-medication administered without my knowledge. He documented Diane's admissions and recommended investigation into potential elder abuse statutes, though at 36, I didn't technically qualify as elderly. The report also recommended review of Graham's therapy license and potential criminal charges for fraud and filing false medical reports. Judge Sullivan read the report in chambers, then called an emergency hearing for the following Monday. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. The hearing was surreal. Diane arrived with her attorney, Graham beside her in support, both of them apparently believing they could still salvage the situation. Andrew presented Dr. Harper's report, Raymond's surveillance evidence, and Dr. Briggs's updated medical assessment. The judge listened to everything, her expression growing colder with each piece of evidence. When Diane's attorney tried to argue that she'd been acting in my best interests, Judge Sullivan cut him off. "Counsel, your client admitted to deliberately over-medicating her husband to create the appearance of incompetence. There's no interpretation of those facts that constitutes acting in his best interests." She denied the guardianship petition, ordered Diane to have no further involvement in my medical care, and referred the matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal prosecution. The district attorney, Thomas Garrett, reviewed the case and brought charges within 2 weeks. Diane was charged with attempted fraud, administering medication without consent, and filing false documents in a guardianship proceeding. Graham faced charges of professional misconduct, filing false medical reports, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His physical therapy license was immediately suspended pending investigation by the state licensing board. The criminal cases moved through the system slowly, but the damage to both of them was immediate and public. Local news covered the story as a cautionary tale about guardian abuse, and Graham's practice collapsed overnight as clients fled. I filed for divorce the day after the guardianship hearing was denied. Andrew connected me with a divorce attorney, Michelle Yang, who specialized in high-conflict dissolutions involving financial fraud. Michelle was aggressive in a way that felt necessary, immediately filing for exclusive control of all marital assets pending the divorce settlement. She argued that Diane had demonstrated willingness to commit fraud and couldn't be trusted with access to joint accounts. The family court judge agreed, freezing Diane out of everything except a small allowance for basic living expenses. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd tried to control my assets by having me declared incompetent, and instead lost control of her own finances entirely. The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of the financial betrayal. Diane had withdrawn $78,000 from our savings over 3 months, claiming medical expenses, but actually funding her lifestyle with Graham. They'd been planning to move to Costa Rica once the guardianship was finalized and the assets liquidated. She'd already transferred $40,000 to an offshore account in her name only. Michelle managed to freeze that account and claw back most of the money, but the revelation of how thoroughly Diane had planned her exit was crushing. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a mistake. It was calculated betrayal, executed while I was literally unable to defend myself. My brother Nathan, who lived 3 states away and whom I deliberately kept uninformed to avoid worrying him, flew in when he learned what had happened. He was furious I hadn't called him sooner, but understood why I'd tried to handle it alone. Nathan took a leave of absence from his job as a software engineer to stay with me during the worst of it, handling things Diane had been responsible for, driving me to appointments, helping with physical therapy now that Graham was gone. Having family I could trust made the betrayal feel less isolating. Nathan kept saying, "I never liked her. Too smooth, you know? Like she was always performing." I wished I'd listened to his instincts years ago. The physical recovery, ironically, became easier once I wasn't being over-medicated. Dr. Briggs assigned a new physical therapist, an older woman named Ruth Kowalski, who'd been practicing for 30 years and had zero tolerance for nonsense. Ruth pushed me hard, but honestly, and within 6 weeks I was walking with a cane, getting stronger daily. The leg would never be perfect, Dr. Briggs warned. I'd likely have arthritis and weather-related pain for life, but I'd walk, I'd work, I'd live independently. That was more than enough. Every step without assistance felt like reclaiming something Diane had tried to steal. The criminal trial for Diane and Graham was scheduled for 9 months after the charges were filed. The prosecution had overwhelming evidence. Dr. Harper's report documenting Diane's confession, my stockpiled pills proving overmedication, Raymond's surveillance photos, Graham's falsified therapy notes, the bank records showing financial fraud. The defense strategy seemed to be painting Diane as a stressed caregiver who'd made poor decisions under pressure, and Graham as a professional who documented what he genuinely observed. Neither narrative held up under scrutiny. The jury took less than 4 hours to convict both of them on all charges. Sentencing came a month later. Diane received 3 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. Graham got 2 years plus permanent revocation of his therapy license. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Lloyd, made clear in her sentencing statement that she viewed their crimes as particularly egregious. "You both exploited a man at his most vulnerable, when he was injured and dependent on others for basic care. You violated professional duties and marriage vows for financial gain." These sentences reflect the seriousness of that betrayal. Watching Diane cry as the marshals led her away, I felt nothing. The woman I'd married had never really existed. This person who'd drugged me and tried to steal my autonomy was a stranger. The divorce was finalized while Diane was in prison. She'd signed the settlement agreement Michelle drafted, probably because she had no leverage and no money for attorneys. I kept the house, the retirement accounts, and virtually all marital assets. Diane received nothing beyond what she'd managed to hide before getting caught, which the court eventually located and redistributed to me as well. Michelle had been ruthless in a way I appreciated. She tried to destroy you when you were helpless. You owe her nothing. The final decree came through on a Wednesday afternoon, 14 months after the accident that had started everything. I was legally free of someone who'd tried to erase my competence and steal my life. Recovery took longer than the legal proceedings. Physical therapy with Ruth continued for a year until I could walk without a cane, jog short distances, return to most normal activities. The psychological recovery was harder. I started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rebecca Stone, who specialized in trauma from intimate partner abuse. It took months to accept that what Diane had done constituted abuse, that her caretaking had actually been captivity, that I'd been a victim of someone I'd loved and trusted. Dr. Stone helped me process the violation of being drugged in my own home, of having my medications weaponized, of being trapped in my body while someone plotted to steal my agency. The firm I worked for had been incredibly supportive throughout everything. They'd held my position, paid my disability leave, sent regular care packages and messages. When I was ready to return, they welcomed me back with modified duties, until I rebuilt stamina. My boss, a man named Douglas, who'd known me for a decade, pulled me aside my first day back. "Ethan, I read about what happened. If you ever need to talk, or if there's anything we can do, just ask." The normalcy of work was healing. Designing infrastructure projects, solving engineering problems, using my mind in ways Diane had tried to prevent. Every calculation, every project review, was proof I was competent and capable. Nathan stayed in touch weekly, calling to check on me, visiting every few months. He'd become fiercely protective in a way that would have annoyed me before, but now felt necessary. He met Ruth during one visit and declared her a badass, which made Ruth laugh. He helped me sell furniture Diane had picked out, redecorate the house in a way that felt like mine, erase the remnants of a marriage built on lies. The Victorian house I'd almost lost became a space I controlled, filled with choices I'd made. Small things, but they mattered. The news coverage eventually faded, replaced by other scandals and tragedies, but occasionally I'd be recognized at coffee shops or grocery stores, people who'd followed the case offering sympathy or sharing their own stories of betrayal. One woman told me about her sister who'd been financially exploited by her husband during cancer treatment. A man described his father losing everything to a caregiver who'd manipulated him during dementia. The patterns were depressingly similar: vulnerability, trust, systematic exploitation. I started speaking at legal conferences about guardian abuse, sharing my story as a case study in what to watch for. 2 years after the accident, I was contacted by a journalist working on a piece about conservatorship abuse. She'd covered my case when it first broke and wanted to do a follow-up feature about recovery and reform. I agreed, partly because I thought the story might help others, partly because I'd reached a point where talking about it didn't hurt as much. The article ran in a major magazine, included interviews with Andrew, Dr. Harper, and Judge Sullivan. It sparked enough interest that I was invited to testify before a state legislative committee considering reforms to guardianship laws. My testimony, alongside other victims and advocates, contributed to new legislation requiring independent medical evaluations in all emergency guardianship cases. Diane was released after serving 20 months. I heard about it through Michelle, who'd set up alerts in case Diane tried to contact me. She'd been released to a halfway house in a different city, required to complete probation, and prohibited from working in healthcare or caregiving roles. The restraining order I'd obtained prevented her from contacting me directly. I never heard from her, never sought information about what she did after prison. She'd become irrelevant to my life, a cautionary tale I shared in professional contexts, but rarely thought about personally. The woman who'd hurt me deepest when I was most vulnerable had lost the power to hurt me at all. Graham's situation was worse in some ways. His license revocation meant he couldn't work in the only field he'd trained for. His name was permanently associated with the case, searchable by anyone considering hiring him. Last I heard, he was working in retail somewhere, a spectacular fall from the medical professional who'd once driven a luxury car and stayed at expensive hotels. The justice wasn't perfect, but it was real. Both of them had paid significant prices for what they'd tried to do to me. I started dating again after 3 years, cautiously and with significant baggage. Trusting someone enough to be vulnerable felt impossible at first. Every potential partner was evaluated through the lens of what Diane had done. Did they seem too interested in my finances? Were they overly solicitous in ways that felt performative? I sabotaged several promising relationships before Dr. Stone helped me recognize the pattern. "You're letting her win again," Dr. Stone said during one session. "She doesn't get to ruin your future relationships. That's giving her power she doesn't deserve." The work of rebuilding trust was slow, but necessary. I met someone eventually, a civil rights attorney named Lauren, who'd read about my case and reached out professionally to discuss guardianship reform. We became friends first, colleagues working on advocacy projects, slowly building trust through shared work. She knew my history, understood my caution, never pushed for more than I could offer. When we finally started dating, it felt different than anything with Diane. Real, instead of performed. Lauren's patience with my need for independence and control was a gift I'd never appreciated before experiencing someone who'd tried to destroy both. 5 years after the accident, I stood in Judge Sullivan's courtroom again, this time as an expert witness in another guardianship abuse case. A woman had tried to have her elderly mother declared incompetent to steal her assets, using methods eerily similar to what Diane had attempted with me. My testimony about the warning signs, the medication manipulation, the false medical documentation helped secure a denial of the guardianship petition. Afterward, the daughter who'd been fighting to protect her mother hugged me and cried, "You saved her. Your story saved my mom." That moment crystallized something I'd been struggling to understand. The worst thing that had happened to me had become a tool to prevent it happening to others. The physical scars from the accident faded to white lines on my shoulder and back. The leg never fully recovered. Dr. Briggs had been right about the arthritis. I walked with a slight limp in cold weather, couldn't run long distances, felt the pins and plates whenever pressure systems rolled through. But I walked, worked, lived independently, exactly what Diane had tried to prevent. Every step was evidence that her scheme had failed, that vulnerability hadn't meant permanent helplessness. Nathan got married to his longtime girlfriend, and I stood as his best man, walking down the aisle without assistance. Lauren sat in the front row, smiling at me with pride and love. The simple act of standing at my brother's wedding felt like a victory over everyone who'd tried to destroy me. After the ceremony, Nathan pulled me aside. 5 years ago, I thought I might lose you to that accident. Then I thought I might lose you to what she did to you. But you're here. You're whole. You're happy. That's everything, man. He was right. I'd survived the accident and the betrayal. That was enough. The house where everything had happened eventually sold. I moved to a smaller place across town, modern and without memories of hospital beds and guest rooms or medication hidden behind nightstands. Lauren and I had been dating for 2 years by then, serious enough that she helped me choose the new place, our tastes aligning in ways that felt natural rather than forced. The Victorian house sold to a young family who loved its character and had no idea what had happened within its walls. I didn't tell them. Some stories don't need to haunt new owners. Work evolved into a specialty practice. I still designed infrastructure, but I also consulted on accessibility standards, using my experience with disability to improve how we built public spaces. The limp that never quite went away gave me perspective on design elements I'd never considered before the accident. Where wheelchair ramps should be placed, how recovery rooms should be configured, what truly accessible means from a user's perspective. The injury that had made me vulnerable had also made me better at my job, more thoughtful about whose needs I was serving. Dr. Stone and I eventually wrapped up therapy after 5 years of regular sessions. She'd helped me process trauma I hadn't known I was carrying, taught me to recognize trust versus control, worked through the complicated grief of mourning someone who was still alive but had never really existed. Our final session was reflective rather than emotional. "You came to me as someone whose agency had been stolen," she said. "You're leaving as someone who's reclaimed it and helped others do the same. That's significant growth." I thanked her for seeing me through the worst period of my life and helping me build something meaningful from it. 7 years after the accident, I testified before Congress about the need for federal guardianship reform. The hearing room was packed with advocates, victims, legal experts, all pushing for legislation to prevent the kind of abuse I'd experienced. My testimony focused on how easily the system could be manipulated, how vulnerable people needed better protections, how medical professionals needed better training to spot exploitation. Several representatives referenced my case in floor speeches when the reform bill eventually passed. The law wasn't perfect, but it closed some loopholes Diane had exploited. Another small victory extracted from disaster. Lauren and I got married in a small ceremony 8 years after the accident. No big wedding, just close friends and family, officiated by Judge Sullivan, who'd presided over the case that had changed my life. She'd agreed to perform the ceremony after I'd asked, touched that I'd want her involved. "You're one of the success stories," she told me during the rehearsal dinner. "Most people who go through what you did don't recover this well, don't find healthy relationships again. You should be proud." I was proud, but also aware that recovery was ongoing, that some wounds never fully healed. The question I'm asked most at speaking engagements is whether I've forgiven Diane. The answer is complicated. I don't carry active anger anymore. That was too exhausting to maintain. But forgiveness implies she deserves it, that what she did was forgivable. Trying to steal someone's agency while they're physically helpless isn't a mistake or a moment of weakness. It's a calculated violation of everything marriage is supposed to mean. She exploited my injuries, drugged me without consent, tried to have me declared incompetent to steal assets we'd built together. That's not forgivable. It's just something I've learned to live with. But I've moved past needing her to suffer more than she already has. She served her time, lost her career and reputation, lives with the consequences of her choices. Whether she feels remorse is irrelevant to my life. I've built something good from the wreckage, found love with someone who respects my autonomy, helped change laws to protect other vulnerable people. Her actions set all of that in motion, unintentionally creating meaning from malice. That's its own kind of justice. The leg still aches in winter, a permanent reminder of the accident that made me vulnerable and the woman who exploited that vulnerability. I consider it a fair trade. The pain reminds me to stay vigilant, to trust carefully, to value the people who showed up when I needed them most. Andrew, who'd fought for my rights when I couldn't fight for myself. Dr. Harper, whose thorough evaluation had saved my autonomy. Nathan, who'd dropped everything to support his brother. Ruth, who'd pushed me to recover without false documentation or hidden agendas. Judge Sullivan, who'd seen through Diane's performance to the manipulation beneath. Those people had restored my faith in human decency when it would have been easy to become cynical. Lauren knows the whole story, has read the court transcripts and news articles, understands why I'm cautious about medication and suspicious of anyone who seems too helpful during vulnerable moments. She respects those boundaries without making me feel broken. When I had surgery last year to remove the hardware from my leg, she stayed with me through recovery, but let me maintain control over my own medications, my own decisions, my own body. That trust, freely given and carefully maintained, feels like the opposite of what Diane had done. It's proof that vulnerability doesn't have to mean victimhood. 10 years after the accident that changed everything, I spoke at a conference for family law attorneys about recognizing guardian abuse. The audience was full of lawyers who'd seen variations of my case, who understood how easily the system could be weaponized against vulnerable people. During the Q&A, someone asked if I'd ever worried that going public with my story would define me, that I'd always be the guy who got drugged by his wife. It was a fair question, one I'd considered often. The answer was yes and no. The case had shaped my life, but it didn't control it. I was an engineer, an advocate, a husband, a brother, a survivor. The betrayal was part of my story, not the whole story. The work continues. Guardianship reform remains an ongoing fight. Too many vulnerable people are exploited by those trusted to care for them. Every year I testify in a few cases, consult on legislation, speak at conferences. It's become part of my identity in ways I never expected. The man who was hurt deepest when most vulnerable has spent a decade trying to prevent others from experiencing the same. That transformation, from victim to advocate, feels like the best possible outcome from the worst possible situation. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.